The Senior Bowl has always been a hotbed for John Schneider's Seahawks draft prospects. Who stood out from this year's crop in Mobile? We've got a special guest set to join us to break it all down, who is on site here on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. A special thanks to all the 12s who are tuning in the middle of the afternoon here on Wednesday, whether you're in Sandpoint, Idaho, or Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Fired up to welcome Dan Viens of the Seahawks Forever podcast back onto the show. We always look forward to that. Dan, I feel like you and I, we've collaborated so much at this point that some people might think we host the same podcast because we've been doing this so much together. But I'm really looking forward to diving into the Senior Bowl because you got the privilege of being on site last week in Mobile, and so many different topics, positions for us to break down, and I'm really looking forward to it as always.
Always good to be on with you, and I love hearing about your new venture. Congratulations on that. That's cool. Glad to hear that you're still going to be involved in Locked On Seahawks. Don't know what we would do without it, but it's good to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this new venture, and I might dive into a little bit on that here on the show at some point, but this is all about the Senior Bowl. We're going to be diving into quarterbacks, defensive linemen, water boys. No, probably not water boys, but we'll be diving into everything from Mobile on this episode that's brought your way by Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use the code all lowercase LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. Dan, I know this was the first time that you got the opportunity to go to the Senior Bowl. And if I'm correct, you were there for the entire thing. You were there for all the practices. You were there for the game as well. And when I went, I just went to the practices, but the game still has some value. The practices obviously are the most valuable during the week. But tell me about the experience and what you were able to soak in, what the process was like, maybe the biggest surprise or two. And I'm interested what it was like for you because I haven't been there since COVID. The two times that I went were pre-COVID. So I know this stuff is leaning more towards what it used to be, but I probably will never be quite the same as it was before the pandemic.
Thought it was really well organized, and they really accommodate the media. They understand. I think Jim Nagy is really in touch with the demand for information. And it really is, they say it's the hashtag, the draft starts in Mobile, and it really is true. That's where all the conversation kicks off, right? And fans are so hungry for that information now, and they accommodate that. I think as much as any event that I've covered or even looked into covering, they are as open to non-traditional media and smaller creators like myself. And even there were people there covering the event that were smaller creators even than me. And they're so open to that. They're kind of out in front of that. And so it was a really cool environment. Lots of guys. There was no lack of people to talk about what you saw with, and everyone from, the big names walking around the field and, kind of rubbing elbows with the front office guys to us in the stands, just trying to soak it all in. The experience itself, I do think I'm probably the only guy that was in Mobile from Sunday to Sunday, right? Like most people, especially the ones that are grizzled veterans, have been there before, kind of, stick and move, get in and out. They know sort of where the most action is, and they try to make the most of their time and be efficient with it. Knowing it was my first time, I just wanted to soak the whole thing in. It's pretty overwhelming. The one takeaway that I would have outside of just how much talent there was there is how you can't watch all these players. You just can't. There's 140 of them before guys started to duck out sort of Wednesday-ish after they had a couple good practices. You can't watch all 140 guys. Once I kind of accepted that, then I was able to make a plan, watch different position groups each day, and sort of use my time as wisely as possible. But it was a great experience. Weather was awesome. Came home to snow. It was 70 and sunny the whole time down there. So loved it. Plan on doing it again.
Yeah, it's like the combine. When I go to the combine every year and you're wanting to partake in the player interviews, and there's so many times there's 4 or 5 guys going at the same time. You're like, I want to talk to all these guys, and you just have to kind of pick and choose. You maybe get to talk to 2 of them during that time, or even training camp practices. And, you know, I've had fans over the years like, well, what did you see from DK Metcalf today? Well, I was mostly watching the defense today because they're on 2 separate fields, you know, and the stuff that we're allowed to report. So I get it. And the Senior Bowl is definitely, when you get that many players out there and all the coaches, you're not going to see everything. That being said, I expect that you saw quite a bit of talent.
A lot.
So first round caliber players. And the narrative out there, Dan, has been that this is a class that doesn't have a lot of first-round players. We've seen the reports from, you know, scouts and, you know, executives that have been unnamed saying, oh, I've only got 9 or 10 first-round players. I'm, at this point, not buying that. Do I think it is an elite class by any means? No.
Right.
But this is not 2013, where you could make an argument there might have been 5 first-round picks in there. This is a group that I at least think has a lot more talent than that. I'm interested in your thoughts coming out of Mobile in general. This is just more of a broad question here in terms of first-round talent, but how did you feel about first-round prospects in Mobile, at least what you were able to see with your own eyes?
Yeah, heading into the event, you know, just kind of soaking in all the other like big top 50 and top 100 lists that were out. You could tell that most of the top guys that expect to be first rounders don't play in the All-Star games. That's just kind of the trend now, right? But as we got through the college football season, got closer to this part of the process, we started to see, and the narrative started to shift a little bit from at the beginning of the college football season, and what it was kind of, you heard a lot of, well, it's just going to not be a great draft. It's very, very balanced. I think from whatever that first round cutoff is, right? The ledge, like 10, 15, whatever it is, from there to 60, 70, 80. I mean, based on the talent that I saw in Mobile, I think it's very, very even talent wise. And it's spread out through a number of premium positions too. And so I think maybe this year more than others, it's all just about fit and what specific teams are looking for. You know, one man's trash is another man's treasure, like a guy that like Mike Green, great example, right? The FCS edge rusher out of Marshall. Well, they're not an FCS, but smaller school program. 17 sacks last year, incredibly productive. There were questions about his length and weight. He weighed in at 251 in Mobile, which is about 15, 16 pounds above what he was listed at all year. So that was a box checked. Yeah, the arms are a little short. They're sub 32 inch, but it didn't matter. He dominated Tuesday and Wednesday to the point that he was one of those guys that checked out because he had done enough, right? And we saw it consistently enough and against enough different types of offensive linemen in what was a pretty solid group down there, that he's a good example of a guy that established himself as a first rounder. I think across the board, I don't think there's any way he gets out of the first round, but he's not for everyone. He's not going to fit everywhere. And I think he's one good example of a lot of what we saw down there, especially on that defensive line, lots of different shapes and sizes.
I want you to real quick just give me 2 or 3 first-round targets that could make sense for the Seahawks at pick number 18. Because, again, not all of the first-rounders are going to be a fit for what the Seahawks do schematically, especially now with the new offensive coordinator. Not all these guys are going to be the right fit. Not all the positions are going to be what the Seahawks are looking for or best fit. But who are 2 or 3 players that jumped out to you that you thought, okay, I can understand if they go this route at pick number 18, this guy would be a good fit?
So if he gets there, I'd be interested to know how they view Mike Green, right? Like the Seahawks, you know, under Pete Carroll and John Schneider were very, very married to their size and spec standards. They had parameters that they stuck to, arm length, all that kind of stuff. They seemed to be in the way that John Schneider drafted the last couple of years that maybe they've opened up their view on that a little bit. But he seems like a guy that, even though we didn't get to see this there, that he's athletic enough and he moves well enough that in addition to what he gives you with burst off the edge in a different way than I think what they have on the roster currently, and something that they could use, I don't think he'd have any problem dropping into coverage the way that McDonald likes to with his guys. So I think he's one. I think Shamar Stewart is another one out of Texas A&M that, again, Tuesday, Wednesday, knocked it out of the park and then walked away. The question on him was production, only 1.5 sacks the last 2 years for the Aggies, but 6'5", 281, a little heavier than some were expecting, but in a good way. And he was just, I don't know what happened at Texas A&M. I don't know how you manage a defense where Shamar Turner gets 1 sack, Shamar Stewart gets 1.5, and Nick Scorton only gets 4. I don't know if it was a scheme thing or what, but he was a problem. He was hard to block all week long. And you saw that length and explosion really show up. And I know you and I have talked before. I think they could use a bigger, more dynamic edge that's different body type and stylistically from Mafe and Hall and Nwosu, assuming he comes back. So I think that's another guy. And then on the offensive line, like, I don't know if he gets to 18. I still, even after his performance at the Senior Bowl, I see him everywhere on consensus big boards from 50 all the way up to the Seahawks range. And a lot of this is dependent, obviously, on how much it's addressed between now and then. But if I'm at 18 and Gray Zabel sitting there, like, I might not even care if I've addressed the offensive line by the draft. Like, he's a guy that can play center or guard. I think he's got all pro awards in his future. He just looked like a guy who eats, sleeps, breathes football, knows how to play, has that nasty demeanor, can move well enough to run that outside zone scheme, and it would be a plug and play guy from day one.
That is maybe the highest riser coming out of this entire process. Gray Zabel, who was on most draft boards listed as 3rd or 4th rounder and now being talked about at 18. And look, from what I saw, the clips I saw, looks like a guy that would be an excellent fit.
And I think a check in his box too. He stuck around. He played in the game, played almost the whole game, played guard in the game, didn't play any center there. He did during the week, but he could have, I would not have batted an eye if he had left early as well, like, because he had accomplished enough, but he stuck around.
Yeah, and I think that that's something John Schneider values. We know the competition aspect, and I don't think they're going to hold that against somebody like a Mike Green either, because if you saw the way he produced the first 2 days, you did what you need to do. Like, are you going to gain any more of those extra couple days? I think it's one of those cases now where that doesn't mean he's not a competitor. I think that there's a business aspect that also goes into it. When we come back with Dan Viens, we are going to specifically single out the offense, and we got to talk quarterbacks. We're going to get to that coming up next year on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by Game Time. You shouldn't have to think about skipping a mortgage payment when you buy tickets to your next big event. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. Recently, I was looking for tickets for the upcoming Bullet for My Valentine and Trivium tour on the Game Time app with Game Time picks. I found amazing deals and could even see the view from my seat before buying. The super deal was particularly impressive, offering great seats at unbeatable prices. Plus, the app's all-in pricing shows the total cost up front. No more surprise fees at checkout. Game Time has deals on the tickets right at the day of the event, and the Game Time guarantee means you'll always get the best price. If you find tickets in the same section row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. What time is it? It's game time. Welcome back to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined here by Dan Viens of the Seahawks Forever podcast. And we're going to continue taking a deep dive into the Senior Bowl. Dan had the privilege to be on site from Sunday to Sunday the entire week. You were an absolute grinder this past week down there in Mobile. And Dan, I want to shift the focus away from, and maybe we'll still have some first round discussion in here when we talk about quarterbacks, but we have to talk about quarterbacks. And I know you and I generally agree on this topic that I think Geno Smith's got to be under center this year. I don't see a better option for 2025 and maybe even 2026, because we'll see how he plays in Clint Kubiak's offense. But still, he's going to be 35 this season. This quarterback class, I'm maybe a little higher now than I was before. I definitely think it's better than the 2022 class, but I still am not overly impressed by this group. I'm curious what you saw. Let's start with the two biggest names that were down there in Mobile, Jackson Dart and Jalen Milroe. And I have my own opinions now on these two guys, but I'm curious now that you've gotten to see these guys front and center, the way they performed this week in Mobile, your thoughts on those two quarterbacks and where you think they're going to fall, maybe where they fit into Seattle's potential plans.
Yeah, the cool thing about being down there and seeing every snap is you go in there with your own preconceived opinions, right? I had my opinions of what I thought Jalen Milroe could be and Jackson Dart, but it was all based on tape. And sometimes it's just human nature. You tend to not necessarily only look for the good things, but only notice the good things, right? And I tend to that's kind of how my scouting mind works. I tend to be more on the side of what can you do versus what can't you do, where I think other people tend to approach it more from like, I'm going to try and tear this guy down until he convinces me that I shouldn't. So I went in with pretty open mind, but feeling pretty positive about both those guys' ceilings for much different reasons. They had very, very different weeks. I thought Jackson Dart consistently day to day, all 3 days plus the game, was the best guy there. I thought he looked really comfortable on day one. Despite there were issues from under center. I know that's got a lot of attention, but I saw that happen with everyone. These guys just don't do it. And that's always a transition. And so if anyone wants to tear him down for that, well, you should probably look at everybody else that's in this draft too. I just thought he looked really comfortable. You could see the arm talent. In this type of event doesn't show off really the elusiveness or the athletic ability of a quarterback, which applied to Milroe too, just because they're trying to play within structure. But you could see it. He's built. I like how he's built, and I just like the way the ball comes out of his hands. He just doesn't, he had a couple bad throws, but he bounces back so well from it. He just seems like a guy that doesn't get rattled. And I've seen examples of that on tape too. So I thought he was consistently the best guy. Again, give him credit for sticking around and playing in the game on Saturday. I don't think he needed to. Milroe was a very different experience. I wanted to, that was an example of, I was trying to find reasons to believe in him, because how can you not be tantalized by that athletic profile?
I get it.
The weird thing about Milroe that I can't wrap my head around, because he's had good coaching in Alabama. He's played, I think he had exposure to Bill O'Brien his freshman year and Tommy Rees. And we saw what Kalen DeBoer's done with quarterbacks in the past, although maybe that had more to do with Ryan Grubb. Like mechanically on the short and intermediate stuff, he's a mess. He's an absolute mess. And how to contrast that with how good he is as a deep ball thrower. Because when he throws it deep, like everything works. His feet match his eyes and matches his upper body, and he's using his lower half properly. And you don't notice the small hands, the way the ball comes out of his hand at all. It's not an issue. He had the fastest rotation and the fastest initial speed on release with the Zebra GPS tracking stuff down there. But the short and intermediate stuff, his footwork's terrible. He stands straight up. He whips it with his arm. So he tends to short arm things and throw balls into the ground to open receivers. He looked like more of a project than I had hoped for. I'm not giving up on him. I still think there's you can tap into it, but I think the boom or bust range is the widest with him. And I came away from the Senior Bowl week thinking he's still an interesting project, but let him be someone else's project.
I took a lot of flack a few weeks ago when I said I had a 5th round grade on him. Look, I feel like at this point that I don't see the pocket presence on film either. If you watch the Michigan game, like he just seems completely oblivious to what's going on around him. So you might have a great deep ball, but like if you've got Myles Garrett bearing down on you in the NFL, like you better have the ability to know that's coming, especially when you're that kind of an athlete. You can get away from guys, but it just seems like he's oblivious to that stuff, the short to intermediate throws. I agree with you. Let him be somebody else's project. That's how I feel. Could the right coach maybe get it out of him? Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm having a hard time having confidence about him as a prospect, to be honest with you. I mean, there's some moments, but there's just way too many bad plays, and there's too many mechanical things and processing things that just jump out. Like that guy has a long way to go till he's going to be ready to play quarterback in the NFL. Real quick, I know there were a few quarterbacks that were kind of under the radar there that stood out to you. Was there one that jumped out that you were intrigued by most, as far as maybe somebody you could get on day 3 that you could mold behind Geno Smith?
Yeah, I'll give you 2. I think Tyler Shuck really opened my eyes. I was familiar with him because I know he started his career in the Pacific Northwest here at Oregon and just got stuck there. And then he went Texas A&M or Texas Tech, and then ended up at Louisville. And I know he kind of had some injury issues, but he's one of those guys where you see what he does in Mobile, and then, okay, he was the first one that I wanted to come home and watch more tape on, because I just wasn't that familiar heading into the game. But He was right there behind Dart as the most consistent performer. He had the bad pick in the game, but that's going to happen, especially in those all-star games. I think when you looked at it, it looked like he was expecting the guy to settle, and he kept anyway. But throughout the week, he might have had the best arm there, even better than Dart. Like, the release is really, really nice. He probably had the best red zone session that I saw on Thursday when that was the emphasis in practice. And he seems to move okay. He has a unique frame now. Not many guys are built like him, 6'5" and sturdy. I thought he really helped himself. And then when you come back and watch the tape, yeah, there's some bad reps, and he's an older guy. That's everybody has their own evaluation of how that fits in. But I think he's a guy you can take on day 3, and he might end up in the right situation, obviously, which you always have to kind of define with these quarterbacks, maybe having a better career than some of the guys that end up ultimately going on day 2. And then I was really impressed with Riley Leonard, more so than I thought I would be. In particular, he was the best guy on day 1, maybe because he had played the most recently, right? He didn't have as much rust to knock off. And he had a great start to the game. If they wouldn't have fumbled, on that drive, I think it looked like they were going to go score. He converted a 3rd and long, had a couple of, had a nice dig route, had a couple of deep middle of the field balls that showed off a little more arm strength than I expected. And he's an A+ character, and I thought he helped himself down here too.
Yeah, those are 2 guys that I think are definitely on the radar. It's interesting because Chuck and I was talking about it yesterday on our show. When you watch some of the tape at Louisville, it's interesting. You can see the zip and the short to intermediate throws, and then some of the deep balls just, for whatever reason, they just flutter and they come up short. I don't know where that comes from. So the throws from Mobile that I saw, you could see a much better arm. So I don't know where the consistency is there. That'd be my concern. Certainly Riley Leonard's a winner. I mean, he made Duke relevant a couple years ago when he was at Duke. Let's go to the offensive line. You mentioned Gray Zabel earlier. He was obviously the superstar of the Senior Bowl.
He was the best guy.
Make an argument that he was the one that gained the most this last week in Mobile. But I want to talk about 2nd, 3rd round guys that the Seahawks could take a look at. And now that we know Clint Kubiak is going to be the offensive coordinator, and there is going to be a ton of wide zone, there's going to be a ton of zone in general. I expect 70+%. That's been the Shanahan system, the Kubiak system. Yeah. It is a zone-oriented system. So there's a specific type of guy that you're going to be looking for that has to have certain athletic characteristics to be able to thrive in a system like that. Who are a few guys on day 2 that maybe casual fans are not familiar with in the draft process that you're thinking that guy could be a really good fit? And it could be tackles too. I mean, Abe Lucas is a free agent after this year, and he's had injuries. So,
well, and the cool thing about this group is so many of them played both. And not necessarily out of necessity, as happens a lot this time of year. Guys get kicked inside because they just can't stick at tackle. We saw there's more cross-training, I think, happening with this group, and guys capable of playing both. I think Ariante Ursary might be the only guy, just kind of off the top of my head, that really played tackle the whole week. Everybody moved around. Even Joseph Savanaya, like, kicked inside to guard, and actually I thought helped himself by moving inside. But oddly enough, to me, some of the guys that stood out the most were some of the smaller school guys. I thought Clay Webb had a great week, and maybe the 2nd best week behind Zabel, a guy that was a 5-star recruit, was the #1 center in the country as a recruit coming out of high school, went to Georgia his freshman year before transferring to Jacksonville State, plays center and guard, played guard in the game. Elite pass protector. That's been the book on him for the last couple of seasons, but a mauler in the run game, just really tough. I don't think I saw him lose a rep in any of the individual stuff. So I thought he was great. He's a guy you can get on day 2. In that same mold, I think Jackson Slater is just a little bit of a notch behind him, similar style, and a guy that we know the Seahawks have met with twice. So that might tell you something. Out of Sacramento State, played guard and center. But as I think about the scheme, as you mentioned, I think that eliminates some guys and it brings other guys into focus. Like, a good example is as good a week as Miles Frazier had, the guard from LSU. Imagine Damian Lewis 2.0, like, very similar body style, mauler in a phone booth. He's a badass on the inside. I don't know that he fits that scheme, but Marcus Bowe out of Purdue, I was a little disappointed because they left him at tackle for the most part. I wanted to see him more inside because he's barely 305, doesn't seem to have the length at tackle, but he's so athletic and his hand usage is so good that I think they wanted to take a long look there. But he's a guy that I think would fit the Seahawks on the interior and be a perfect fit for that scheme.
When we come back, we are going to switch gears over to the defensive side of the ball. And honestly, this is what I'm most excited about because I think the defensive line is the deepest positional group in this entire draft, from outside to the interior. We're going to be breaking that all down coming up next year on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. We're closing in on the big game coming up this weekend, and there's no better way to make it even more exciting than with Prize Picks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With over 10 million members and billions in winnings awarded, Prize Picks makes it fun and simple to get into the action. Here's how it works. You pick more or less on at least 2 player projections. If you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. Prize Picks even has a free pick for the big game, with Patrick Mahomes needing just 1 yard to win. Pair that with one more correct pick, and you're cashing out. This week, I'm looking at the board, and I'm expecting a big game from Saquon Barkley in the rushing department. What I love most, Prize Picks offers fast and safe withdrawals. When I win, my cash is in my account in as little as 15 minutes. Here's a special offer for our Locked On NFL listeners. You can download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's right, $50 instantly when you play just $5. Prize Picks, run your game. Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, Wednesday edition. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be teaming up for today's show with my good friend, Dan Viens of the Seahawks Forever podcast. And Dan, we're taking a deep dive into everything Senior Bowl. We just talked quarterbacks and offensive line. Let's shift now to the defense. And this is my opinion, and I'll be interested if you agree or you have a little different opinion on this. But I just feel like the defensive line in general, I'd say the edge especially, the edge seems like there's a lot of top-tier talent and there's a lot of depth at that position. But it just seems like the defensive line, that is the crown jewel of this class. You didn't get to see Abdul Carter, obviously, in Mobile. Right. There were a few other top guys that weren't there for this game. But you talked Mike Green earlier, Shamar Stewart. There were a few other guys that weren't maybe on the radar that had really good weeks as well. I'm just curious about your general assessment of the defensive line. And let's focus on the edge here first, because, again, that just seems like the position group that has the most upper tier talent and the most depth in this draft class, at least from what I've evaluated so far.
Yeah, it was interesting. I think the narrative early in the week was the offensive line might be the best group there. But by the end of the week, and certainly in the game, then we get to game time, and, you know, the national team, I think they had 8 sacks. They were just dominated that American offensive line, which was made up of a lot of smaller school guys. I think by the end of the week, everyone agreed that group, inside and outside and edge, was the best overall. And you're right, a lot of the top guys weren't there. But I think I was just listening to Daniel Jeremiah this morning, and in his top 50, I think over a third of them are defensive linemen. That edge group is interesting in again, every different shape. There's some undersized guys, but guys you can't really ignore, right? Like Ezeraku from Boston College. Like, he had a great early part of the week, and he's a little bit shorter than you usually like on the edge, but he's so explosive. And then, you know, we talked about Mike Green, but then you have the other end of the spectrum too. You know, the Shamar Stewarts of the world. I was really impressed. 2 guys really stood out for me in that edge group that I wasn't familiar. This is probably the favorite part of the experience, is getting to see guys that I really didn't know much about. Savion Jones from LSU just kept impressing more and more as the week went on and dominated in the game. I think he had 2 sacks and 2 tackles for loss. Really, really long. I think he had the one of the top 3 wingspans down there, and just looked like he's the guy you want getting off the bus. And if he's not first, the guy getting off the bus right behind him is Femi Oladejo from UCLA, another guy that just looked like he was made in a factory. And you see some of the pass rush tools, although you see the rawness, and then you find out that he played off-ball linebacker until last year and is just now kind of growing into that position. Another guy, 2 sacks in the game, couple tackles for loss. He was a beast, and a guy that I think probably still, because of the depth in this class, he might not be a lock to go day 2, but would give you excellent value later on. I think would really fit in Seattle too.
Yeah, I think that you could make an argument that there are at least 3 or 4 players in this draft class that in other draft classes, they might be easy second, third rounders that could be available on day 3. That's just the depth you're talking about.
Yeah.
And in the interior might not have the flashy names. And look, Seattle's got Leonard Williams. They have Byron Murphy the second. That is a strength for this team. But Jaron Reed and Jonathan Hankins are going to be free agents.
Yeah.
And I feel like that is a positional group. You can never have enough dudes. And especially when you're not potentially going to have your nose tackle. I know there's a few nose tackles in this draft class that are not your prototypical run stuffers. And Yahya Black being one of them, that watching the film, I could make an argument for late in the first round potentially for him. But I'm curious what you saw in Mobile from that defensive line class, the interior D line, and whether you see that being a position Seattle could still be attracted to a pick early, even with the talent they have at the top of their depth chart.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've been talking about a true interior guy, nose tackle type, not necessarily just a one-trick pony type, but someone to allow, free up Byron Murphy a little bit, right? I think that's something that's been talked about for a while. And there were a lot more of them in this draft. They just weren't there in last draft, really the last couple. But there were a bunch, and they were even in Mobile. You talk about Black, he's just a beast. I think his dimensions, he's the one. He was up there with Savion Jones, 84 and a quarter inch wingspan, 6'5 and a half, 337, 10 and a quarter inch hands, big 35-inch arms. Yeah. And heavy hands. He was impressive everywhere he went. He's got an edge to him. Every little dust up I saw during the week, I'd turn my head he's in the middle of it. You can make what you want out of that. He didn't make the impact that I was hoping for. He didn't make a lot of plays down there, but he's a guy that I think is probably going to shine in Indianapolis and look really, really impressive down there. But if you're looking for like a nose tackle type, like you mentioned, yeah, I know going into the week, Deion Walker had a lot of attention out of Kentucky. It's probably one of those guys you're referring to. He's not a true nose tackle. He's really high cut for 345 pounds. He doesn't have a strong lower half. I really wasn't impressed with him. But there were a couple guys. Jamari Caldwell out of Oregon was having a really, really good week until he pulled up lame on Thursday. Couldn't play in the game on Saturday. Moves really well, really quick and sudden for a guy that's 330 pounds. Cameron Jackson out of Florida is another one that really caught my eye, like initially in the bag drills, the individual stuff, like moving at 345 pounds, the way he moves. But he's a day 3 guy all day you can get really good value with. And then Alabama does it every year. Guys that you don't hear about, they don't get a lot of publicity, but Tim Smith, he's smaller than those other guys, 310, 315. He had a very, very consistent week in both, drills where he's defending inside run, but had a little juice to him too. So there was a lot to choose from down there, even though, as you mentioned, some of the top guys aren't there. Like we didn't see Kenneth Grant and some of those other guys.
As far as the linebackers, corners, and safeties are concerned, the Seahawks, at least on paper, if Ernest Jones is re-signed, which I know that you agree with me, that's got to be the top priority for this football team going into the offseason. But assuming you have Jones back, you've at least got your starting lineup set at all 3 of those positional groups. But there could be some depth concerns at all 3 spots. I'm curious for your general thoughts on those position groups and maybe just specifically which position from those 3 that you saw the most talent that could fit what Mike McDonald wants in his defense, and maybe a few players that fit the bill as well.
Those 3 positions you just listed were the least dynamic of the groups that were down there. Nobody just really stood out. There might not be a first rounder among that group. There's a couple of the corners, Azariah Thomas and Malik Harrison's or Maxwell Harrison's getting a little bit of like maybe first round buzz. I think at the end of the day, out of those 3 position groups, there might not be a single guy from the Senior Bowl drafted in the first round. That doesn't mean there wasn't talent here. But linebacker was really thin. I was really watching it on Thursday, trying to find a guy that I could like. I thought Jeffrey Bossa had a good week, although he played mostly Mike in college, but he's built more like a weak side guy. I thought if something goes awry and they don't re-sign Ernest Jones, because I don't think he'd be a fit on the roster if they do, Demetrius Knight, out of Texas Tech had a really, really good week, or South Carolina had a very good week. He's one of those unusual inside linebackers we don't see much of in the draft these days. 245 pounds, built like you would think a 245 pounder would be, can really come up and thump in the run game. And then probably the most consistent guy day in, day out was Jack Kaiser. He can play, I think he can play Mike and Will, but he's 6'1", 222. You know, that seems to be the trend, but he just makes plays. The cornerback group, if you're looking for a slot guy, there were some players in there, but not a lot of long corners in Mobile this year. Darian Porter, Iowa State, he was there for the first couple days and then showed himself the door. But a lot of 5'10", 5'11" guys and some guys that are 170, 180 pounds playing in the slot. But if that's the direction they want to go, maybe the solution to, you know, some questions that we might have at outside corner on this roster can be fixed by playing Witherspoon more outside, and you do target a slot guy. I thought Quincy Riley out of Louisville had a great week, especially in the red zone stuff. A couple pass breakups in the end zone, had a pick six he dropped. I'm sure he'd like that one back. Jalen Smith out of USC, one of the many Jalens that were in Mobile, another kind of smaller guy that probably projects inside. He had a good week. And some of the small school kids stood out as well. And then safety, it's hard to find a guy that you can really get excited about from that group. But of them, I thought Sebastian Castro looked the part the most, you know, and Iowa certainly has a good history of producing DBs. But he looked like kind of a hybrid guy that Mike McDonald might be able to do some things with, where he could play kind of a big nickel and play that third sort of safety role. Almost built a little bit more like a weak side linebacker.
As always, Dan, greatly appreciate having you on the podcast. Great insight and outstanding work from Mobile. This is going to be a theme for me leading up to the draft. I got to finish up with one question, and the answer can be real quick, but this is just because to me, this is the one, for some fans, this might be viewed as a nightmare scenario, but if Ashton Genty falls to pick number 18 and you are John Schneider, are you pulling the trigger? Are you drafting him and seeing, hey, I'll see if I can move a couple of my running backs or whatever? That is the big question to me, because every year there's a position where it's like best player available. In this case, it would obviously be him. I guess I'm just wondering your insight or your view on that.
I want to say yes, because BPA, right? BPA. And if he's going to be a generational talent, then, you know, screw the critics. Don't worry about what fans are going to think. Take him, figure the rest out later. Maybe you trade a guy. But this running back group is so deep. I've seen as many as 33 draftable grades out of this group. And even though none of the top guys were in Mobile, there was still a ton of talent. With where the Seahawks roster is today, and John Schneider say he figures need into their grades when they're looking at their board, right? I have to believe there's a different direction. And if they think they want to add someone to that running back group, man, you can get some really good talent on days 2 and 3. So I would say no, as tempting as that would be.
Yeah, that definitely would be. I think John Schneider would be sweating that out a little bit if that happened, because we know how John Schneider
comes out. Yeah, trade down, baby, trade back,
trade down, and then maybe I don't think he gets to 18. I think he's a top 10 pick, but we know running backs, the value has been lowered, so maybe that could be something that happens. But as always, you can follow Dan at Seahawks Forever on X and on Blue Sky as well. He's like me; the two of us have dipped onto Blue Sky, and he's got tons of awesome Senior Bowl content that you can review, more in-depth even than we could cover on this podcast. Dan, greatly appreciate having you on. Make sure 12s to take a gander over to the Seahawks Forever podcast on YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. And as always, make sure to check out Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Rob Rang will be joining me again for our Thursday episode, and we're going to start taking a little bit of a look at some free agent options, because guess what? Free agency is just around the corner. Make sure that you're listening in, and thanks for tuning in to today's episode. Go Hawks.
Go Hawks.